This is January 2023, and I'm sorting out some things that I have been sort of confusing. Still, the mist is still there, but I'm beginning to see some patterns. That's how knowledge goes. We perceive patterns, and then those patterns fall into expectations that we can live with. Well, I want to talk about the transitional nature of the present time. I think it's emblematic of the time that the gender issues of trans people has been sort of foremost in a lot of the Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, other places on the web. I think that partly that's due to the fact that people have free access to it, but it's also partly due to the fact that we're in a shifting moment in our lives. The dominant reality is not quite the same as it used to be. Now, I was born in 1945, which will tell you that I'm 77 years old, so I've lived through quite a bit. In 1945, I was born in March, a couple months before the victory in Europe and about 6 months before the victory in Japan, in which my father was actively involved, going to Guam, Saipan, and Okinawa. We literally did not see each other. I was born, and I saw him briefly as he went overseas, but I did not see him for 2 years because he was part of the occupation of Japan. Now, I thought the 1950s were probably the dullest time in the life of the United States. I was a kid and I didn't know very much, and I'm sure that a lot of it had to do with that. But, and it was also a time as a kid, I lived in a relatively small town, so we got our bikes and went wherever we wanted to. Those days are largely over now because of probably because there are a lot of us, and probably because the norms of society have changed considerably from that moment to this. We had been sort of the leader of the winners of the Second World War, and so the United States was kind of the place to be. Everything flowed toward it. Our economy was still intact, while Germany and Europe had been all devastated. Eventually, we woke up to that fact and instituted the Marshall Plan to try to help some of those economies recover, and they did. That was a moment of transition. It was also a moment of disorientation because the United States was not used to being sort of the leader of the pack, and was the leader of the pack for, well, probably up until well into the 1990s. Still looked to as the leader of the pack, but now we're in a different moment of transition. It's a moment that started probably with Ronald Reagan, which was, 35 years ago, 40 years ago, and he was looking to small government. Now, he was a wealthy man, and he was looking to small government because the government that he'd grown up with, had been part of, had taken a lot of his income in taxes. He didn't like that, and so he made sure that people who had money were able to keep as much of it as they could. And that's been the mantra of the Republican Party ever since. cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes. The problem is that government does actually do some things that it needs to do that aren't done by private industry, and to and including the setting of boundaries for markets. One of the problems with capitalist markets is that they go wherever they want to go. And it's only with some kind of regulation that which helps maintain them. We're sort of fighting through that. Laissez-faire folks, the ones who don't want to be any regulation, are in the dominant species right now. But, we go with that, we get back into the kind of misery that was created in the 1930s with the Depression. And in those days, the working class was largely oriented toward Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats. In the 1960s, the Democrats, being the dominant party at the time, passed civil rights legislation, and almost immediately, the South and those places that didn't agree with those changes began to shift into the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party had basically won the Civil War, so people were Republicans proudly before because they had saved the Union. By the 1950s and 60s, they weren't so much interested in that anymore, and they began to shift. In the 1970s and on, the business leadership shifted. They used to be, during the post-World War II period, the leadership took care of the middle class in its own way. Then in the 1970s, it began to push back against unions and basically destroyed the union base in the private sector. Now, in the public sector, unions are still quite strong, but in the private sector, they've been all but destroyed, except for a few unions in here and there. But it was unions that really protected and provided programming, government programming, which made it possible for the middle class to thrive and survive. By the 1990s, those programs were disappearing, even with the help of the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton. But these transitions go on all the time. And they're about power. One of the great transitions of the moment is that we're hearing a lot about Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd. We're hearing about Me Too, which is oriented toward the sexual misconduct of men toward women. All of these things have risen up because we are in a moment of transition. The trans people are also stating their case, and racial minorities, including Native Americans, are stating their case on social media. And we're also noticing that the white population is about 50%, 57% of the population. It is, in most places, still a majority, maybe not in California, perhaps parts of Texas, it is no longer a majority. But in most places, it still is and will be for the foreseeable future. However, the power needle has shifted. And you notice I moved that to my right. probably your left. But the left doesn't hardly exist in this country. We're right of center or center oriented country. And the most active media, I think, is on the right. There is some MSNBC on the left, but doesn't have quite the purchase that Fox News does. Anyway, we are in a moment of transition. That moment, it's always hard to know exactly what's going to happen. Like any transition, I think of those people during the Civil War when Quantrill was running around this part of the world. I live in Kansas City, and he was terrorizing people in isolated rural areas. Would have the Southern flag and the American flag, and they would fly the one they thought that the group that was coming upon them was, because that's what happens in a civil war. You have to, if you're in a settled spot, you have to play both sides. The same is true as the power shifts in, you have to sort of play both sides and figure out which one is for you. Now, as I look at the immigrant groups in the country, as they came in, they were all pretty much discriminated against. Probably the Germans had the least amount of discrimination until World War I, when a lot of them changed their names to, well, like in my family, it was von Wiesehanna was changed to Weishand. Ugh. Great name like Wiesehan and Weishand, come on. Anyway, they did change their names because they were discriminated against. But in terms of assimilation, the Germans probably had the easiest time of it, though not easy. All of the immigrant groups have had trouble assimilating. And what happens is a number of things. I noticed this most recently, I think, with the Vietnamese groups. There's an element of organized crime that gets up because they can take power. There isn't much power when you're a minority, and so organized crime offers one venue. Whether it's the organized crime of the Italians or the organized crime of the Irish or the organized crime of any really immigrant group. That's one way of seizing power. Also, in our country, we have the Supreme Court, which allows minorities the opportunity to push against the majority. Thurgood Marshall in the 1950s, as a Supreme Court justice, well, he wasn't then, he was a lawyer, but for the NAACP, they got the Supreme Court to decide against Plessy versus Ferguson, which was from the 1890s, and they tried to integrate the schools that way. It created, in the South anyway, largely the development of private academies that were really there to avoid racial integration. Now that changed slowly. It has changed a little, but a number of those academies then became integrated with superior black students. Nevertheless, it was the way that transition was dealt with. Some people resist, some people beckon it to come on. The transitions we're having now, if you think, black people have been in this country since 1619. Of course, they weren't liberated from slavery until 63, and truly not until the end of the Civil War, 1865. And there was a period of time where the federal government federalized most of the southern states who had been in the Confederacy. After General Grant, who became President Grant, after his period, he actually did quite a bit to try to provide for a power base for the black people. And of course, blacks in those days were Republicans because the Republican Party had freed them from slavery. You still have some black who are part of the Republican Party, but if you talk to them, you realize that they trace their families back to probably people who were office holders during the Reconstruction. Well, the point I'm actually thinking about, and I'm just trying this, it may not float. What happens in second and third generation immigrant groups is that they begin to take power for themselves. They begin to spend money at their immigrant-oriented businesses. They begin to look the other way when things like organized crime in their group happens. They tend to begin to express their friction against the everyday slights that they receive, which they do. So we hear that from native people who have been here longer than anybody, but who are rising up with the rest of this group in times of transition. Native people, blacks, Hispanics, they're all beginning to push against white domination. Now, to be fair, when you're in the majority, you tend to run things. If you go to Santa Fe, for instance, you realize that Spanish-speaking people, by and large, run Santa Fe. Now, it's not totally that way, but it just is what it is. That's what happens when you gain power, especially when you're pushing against a large majority, like the white majority has been in this country. The white majority is losing ground. But they're not going to go away quietly. As we already know, we've already heard from the Proud Boys and those kinds of racist groups. And we've already had a couple of profound experiences of misogyny. Now, Hillary Clinton was probably the most qualified presidential candidate ever. She wasn't a very good candidate. In other words, she didn't run a great campaign because there was so much friction against her from her long past in public life. But nevertheless, that was I think, a sort of resurgence of misogyny. Anyway, things come and go. Racism flares up and then it tamps down. Right now it's flaring up. And it's flaring up at least partly because whites are kind of looking around and saying, what's going on here? And some of them think, well, the way to do this is to reassert white privilege and power. Unfortunately, it's probably too late for that. at least in some parts of the world of the United States. And we're in close league with Mexico and Canada. Canada has a large French-speaking population. So the kind of diversity that white supremacists want is not going to work in the world that we happen to live in. Now, as I say, whites are a substantial majority for the moment. And the history of white domination has not been great. I like the way one Australian commentator expressed it when he said that the United States, for the most part, externally, has not been operating as a colonial empire very much, at least not visibly. We use power against people who don't have it, but we do it without occupying their country. But internally, we have operated as the conquest of this particular part of the world was a colonial conflict. It was taken over by a colonial mindset. The Indian Wars were pretty much run from Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. That was the part of the command structure. And they weren't going to put up with nomadic Indian bands running around the country wherever they wanted to go. They tried to get them onto reservations, and they eventually did. The last hurrah was probably in Wyoming. And if you've ever spent any time in Wyoming, you realize why the native people fought as hard as they did and frequently prevailed in that part of the world. Absolutely splendid place. But what I'm trying to say is that as we are transitioning and we're swimming through the fog trying to figure out where we're going, I think as I look at black population, if I think of it as second or third generation immigrants, now realizing that they're not second or third generation immigrants, they are maybe 8 or 9 generations, 10 generations, more even for some, not all. But if we think of them as a group, in second generation or third generation immigrants, they are making all the moves that second and third generations make, which is to assert their presence and to take umbrage at the things which are nasty and terrible to them. The daily slights, the clear power trips that they have put upon them, and the insults, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune are theirs because they are functionally like a second or third generation immigrant group. Now, they're not a group. People have melanin in their skin. You don't see much melanin in that skin. But if they have melanin in the skin, they're sort of all lumped together. But they're not together. They come from all over Africa, their ancestors, and largely their cultural heritages were taken away from them. They were forced into sort of white Christian cultural traditions, and then they took over and made them their own. The black church has been strong for people of color, but people of color are not a homogeneous group. They're all quite different. Those people who are in high culture, who sing opera or actors on a much wider stage, they exist in a certain vacuum of celebrity. But for the average person who is a person of color, who the assertion of their rights to be treated like dignified human beings is very much second and third generation immigrant reality. Now, it's kind of hard to see progress when you've been 10 or 12 generations in this country, and some old guy, white guy like me, is talking about second and third generation. But as a group, the slings and arrows, as I say, are being dealt with, are beginning to be dealt with. At least you pay any attention to social media, you'll see that. On the other hand, you'll also see the obvious white reaction, which has become more prominent in political circles with the Tea Party and all of the movements on the right. There has been a counter-reaction to that. Such a strong reaction that the Republican Party will be pretty soon the party of the working class. And you're beginning to see the friction with corporate America on the right, where it's never been before, because those transitions are taking place. The point I'm making is that there is some progress, but it's it's 3 steps forward and 2 to the rear. It's slow, it's transitional, but more and more people are aware of the transition and are taking it to heart. Well, as we work our way through this time of transition, my particular joy is in those people who are taking umbrage, and Native people and Black people and Hispanic people and others who are saying, when you act that way, it's an insult. And white people say, oh, I didn't realize that. I mean, we've gone a long way from minstrel shows in the 1950s, which I remember clearly as an item, no longer happens. Blackface is an embarrassment if one has done that. So slowly, norms are changing. But I think it's good to notice that as those norms change, people also push back. Our LGBTQ people are being pushed back against. They've had some recent victories. Thank goodness people, many gay and lesbian people who've been together for many years have been able to get married. That's a wonderful thing because it allows them to offer publicly what has been going on with them privately for a long time. I want to finish with a particular prayer from our morning prayer service, which is it's a mission prayer actually, but I love this prayer. O God, you have made of one blood all the peoples of the earth. There is no racial difference between us. You have made of one blood all the peoples of the earth and sent your blessed Son to preach peace to those who are far off and to those who are near. Grant that people everywhere may seek after you and find you. Bring the nations into your fold, pour out your Spirit upon all flesh, and hasten the coming of your kingdom through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Go for it in this transition time. Take umbrage if that's what you need to do. Resist if you need to do. We're getting clarity is what's happening. And we're going to move that dial. Who knows where it'll stop? It just never stops. It goes on. Blessings to you.